Hey guys! Tonight we begin with something less glamorous than knights and dragons, but far more important if you ever found yourself waking up in a medieval village. We're talking about hygiene, not the kind with minty toothpaste and warm showers, but the medieval kind, the kind with mud floors, chamber pots, and a casual relationship with the concept of soap. If you've ever wondered how people in the Middle Ages smelled, the answer is usually bad. But there's more to it than just dirt and body odor. So before we dive in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what we do here. And let me know in the comments what century you think you'd last the longest in. Now dim the lights, maybe light a candle if you're feeling immersive, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's be clear. No one in the medieval world woke up thinking, "Today, I will exfoliate." Hygiene wasn't a routine. It was a negotiation between what was practical, what was available, and what wouldn't get you accused of sorcery. Bathing existed, but not in the way we think of it. There were no hot showers, no body scrubs, and definitely no scented shampoos. If you were lucky, and by lucky I mean rich, you might bathe in a wooden tub filled with lukewarm water once every few weeks. If you were a peasant, you probably didn't. Bathhouses did exist in medieval towns, especially across Europe and the Islamic world. But they weren't always places of cleanliness. Sometimes they were places of business, gossip, and occasionally the kind of intimacy best left to local rumors. Soap, in the way we know it, was rare. There was lye soap, harsh and rough on the skin, more likely to leave you red and dry than refreshed. People used herbs, ashes, or even sand to scrub themselves, which sounds less like hygiene and more like an attempt to erase your skin entirely. Still, the intention was there. They knew dirt was unpleasant. They just didn't have the tools or understanding to deal with it effectively. Teeth were another story. Toothbrushes didn't exist. Toothpaste didn't either. Some people chewed twigs, rubbed their teeth with cloth, or used salt and ashes. Did it help? Maybe a little. But dental hygiene wasn't a priority unless your tooth hurt so badly you begged the village blacksmith to remove it with pliers and no anesthetic. Fun times. And don't even start on toilets. In cities, if you were lucky, there were public latrines, which were essentially long benches with holes and no privacy. In castles, they had garderobes, stone seats hanging over open-air shafts. In villages, you just used the garden, or the alley, or a bucket, and that bucket got tossed out the window. Yes, that's real. Gardez l'eau, they shouted in French towns, meaning watch the water, which actually meant watch the flying waste. Sidewalks didn't exist. Streets were narrow and full of things you didn't want to step in. Clothing didn't help either. People didn't change clothes daily. You had one outfit, maybe two if you were wealthy. Underwear was optional. Laundry was rare. And washing clothes didn't involve detergent. It involved beating fabric with sticks near a stream while hoping the wind dried it before mold did. And deodorant? That was called holding a posy of flowers under your nose and pretending no one noticed the stench. But despite all this, people weren't stupid. They understood that clean water mattered, that bad smells meant something was wrong. Monasteries, for instance, were surprisingly clean. Monks often washed their hands before meals, bathed regularly, and built sophisticated latrines that used running water. Not because they were modern, but because they believed cleanliness was part of godliness. Public bathhouses, when not banned for being immoral, were places of social order. and people with wounds or sickness tried to stay clean in the only ways they could. The problem wasn't intent, it was access. Clean water was hard to find. Soap was expensive. Medical knowledge was limited. And sometimes smelling bad was safer than standing out. Smelling too clean made people suspicious. Was it vanity? Witchcraft? Did you boil herbs under a full moon while chanting? Because that's not hygiene. That's asking for a trial. So no, the Middle Ages weren't full of people proudly rolling in filth. They were full of people doing their best in a world that made staying clean almost impossible. The dirt wasn't always a choice. It was a symptom of the times, of cold winters, crowded cities, and a world where water could carry death as easily as life. Because that's another part of the story. Water wasn't always safe. And in the next part, we'll talk about why the same river that gave you water for soup might also give you plague. So, you're living in a medieval town. Maybe you're a baker, a blacksmith, or just someone trying to make it through the week without freezing or starving. You need water, not just to drink, but to cook, wash, and clean. The river runs nearby. Seems perfect. Until you realize that the same river is also the town's drain, sewer, laundry spot, and sometimes cemetery. In many medieval settlements, rivers were life, but they were also disease. People dumped everything into them, waste from chamber pots, spoiled food, butcher remains, dead animals, even the occasional human body. And then, just a little downstream, someone scooped up a bucket of water to make soup. There was no separation, no concept of upstream and downstream sanitation, no water treatment plants, just hope. Wells were safer, at least in theory. They pulled water from underground and were often protected by stone walls. But even wells could become contaminated. A dead rat, a leaky cesspit, a flood that carried filth straight into the groundwater. Suddenly, the whole village was drinking something that smelled slightly wrong and felt suspiciously warm. But when you're thirsty, you drink. When you're hungry, you cook with it. And when you're sick, no one thinks to blame the bucket. Boiling helped, but it wasn't common knowledge. Most people didn't understand germs. The theory of disease was based on humors, miasmas, or divine punishment. If you fell ill, it wasn't because you drank sewer stew. It was because you sinned, the air was bad, or Saturn was in a bad mood. Water didn't kill you. The stars did. Monasteries and some wealthy households had the means to filter or boil water. They used cloth to strain out debris, or they kept rainwater in barrels. But for most people, water was fetched, not questioned. And when it made you sick, well, maybe that was just your time. And that brings us to waste. Not metaphorical waste, but the real smelly, unavoidable kind. Human waste was a constant problem. In villages, it often ended up in ditches, fields, or the street. In towns, it went out the window. In castles, it dropped through shafts into pits or moats. Some cities passed laws. Don't throw waste from the second floor between noon and vespers. But enforcement was optimistic. Guardrabes, those castle toilets that hung over the edge, were less glamorous than they sound. The shaft didn't go far. It ended in a pile, sometimes a moat, sometimes a pit, and those pits had to be emptied, not by magic, but by people. Gong farmers, as they were called in England, were hired to shovel out human waste by the cartload. It was dangerous, disgusting work. They worked at night. They smelled terrible. But they were paid well because no one else wanted the job. The smell of a medieval town wasn't just bad, it was constant. It clung to everything: leather, cloth, hair. You couldn't escape it. Even royalty couldn't. A noblewoman might wear silk, but beneath it, her skin hadn't touched soap in weeks. A king might dine on golden plates, but the air around his palace still carried the scent of the stables and the kitchens. And everywhere, waste. Underfoot, under windows, around corners. Rats were common. So were fleas. So was illness. And yet, somehow, people lived. They adapted. They found routines. In some towns there were street cleaners, waste collectors, even public fines for dumping in the wrong place. Bathhouses had rules, wells had covers, markets had inspectors who tried desperately to keep rotten meat off the stalls. It wasn't modern hygiene, but it was a kind of order. Still, nothing stopped the outbreaks: plague, dysentery, typhoid. Illness spread faster than gossip. One bad barrel of water, one careless butcher, and suddenly a whole street was sick. And people didn't blame the system. They blamed fate, or sin, or foreigners, or that strange wind last week. Because in the medieval mind, cleanliness wasn't science. It was suspicion. And even clean water couldn't be trusted if it came from the wrong place. Let's say you were a craftsman in a small medieval town. You spent your days working iron, wood, or leather, your fingers cracked from cold mornings and rough tools, your clothes stiff with sweat, smoke, and ash. You might wash your hands now and then. Maybe. If there was water and no line at the well, and you hadn't just run out of rags again. But soap? Number. Not the soft, foamy kind with lavender in the label. You scrubbed with whatever you had. A dry cloth, a handful of sand. Sometimes even the same knife you used to clean fish. People didn't clean because it felt good. They cleaned because dirt got in the way. It clogged wounds, irritated skin, infected cuts. You didn't need to understand bacteria to know that grime made things worse. So you wiped, you scraped, you rinsed, you hoped. But even when you tried, you couldn't get it all off. The black around your fingernails was permanent. The smell of tallow and soot never quite left your sleeves. And when you slept, you carried the day's filth with you into straw that hadn't been changed in months. Now imagine getting hurt. Not a dramatic sword wound, just something normal. A splinter, a burn, a blister that split open after too many hours holding an axe. There were no Band-Aids, no antiseptic. Maybe someone had a cloth. Maybe you had a pinch of salt. Maybe someone muttered a prayer. But even then, even if you managed not to bleed too much or faint from the pain, the real danger didn't come until later. The swelling, the fever, the heat under your skin that told you the wound wasn't healing, it was rotting. Slowly, people lost fingers like that, arms, lives, all from something as small as a cracked heel that let in infection from the mud outside. And if it spread, if the rot turned black, there was only one solution: amputation. No anesthesia, no sterilized blade. Just a strong man with a saw and two others to hold you down while someone, usually not a doctor, said, "Bite this." Medicine, such as it was, did what it could. Barbers doubled as surgeons. Priests handed out holy water and hope. And if you were lucky, someone's grandmother remembered which herbs to boil for pain. But hygiene wasn't part of the plan. Tools weren't cleaned. Wounds weren't covered properly. And the word infection hadn't been invented yet. If you lived, it was a miracle. If you died, it was expected. And this wasn't just about peasants. Nobles got sick too. Castles had stone floors and drafty halls. Their doctors had titles but no training. Their beds were cleaner, but only in comparison. And when someone coughed blood, no one asked about hand washing. They asked which saint they had offended, or which comet passed last week. Bathing helped, in theory, but by now you've probably guessed, bathing had its own problems. Not just the lack of hot water or privacy, not just the difficulty of heating enough water to fill a tub that was really just a big barrel with a lid. The problem was belief. People thought hot water opened the pores, and open pores, they believed, let in disease. So the logic went like this: wash too often and you'll get sick. Sweat was protection, dirt was a shield, and cold water was the safer option. So some people bathed once a month, others once a year, and some just didn't bother. They wiped their hands on their cloaks, they brushed ash from their faces, they rinsed their feet in streams when it rained, and they survived mostly because the human body is stubborn and medieval life was a game of chance. But if you wonder why so many people died young, or why graveyards filled so quickly, it wasn't just war and famine. It was everything else. The scratch that turned septic, the cough that lingered, the cut that never closed. Because in a world without antiseptic, hygiene wasn't about looking good. It was about staying alive. And most people, despite their best efforts, lost that fight far too soon. If there was one thing that united almost everyone in the medieval world, it was not religion or language or land. It was lice. The tiny creatures that lived in hair, on skin, in bedding, and even inside clothing seams were not a sign of poverty or laziness. They were simply a part of life. From the poorest beggar curled under a cart to the wealthiest noble in a stone-walled bedroom, lice were just there. They crawled, they bit, they laid eggs, and they stayed. And there wasn't much you could do about it. Hair care, if you could call it that, was basic. Most people kept their hair long, tied back, or covered. Washing it was rare, combing it was occasional, and cutting it was done more for practicality than style. Some shaved their heads completely and wore cloth caps or hoods to keep warm. Others used coarse combs carved from bone or wood to drag out the lice and nits. But the combs didn't kill them. They just moved them around. And sometimes all you could do was sit by the fire and pick them out, one by one, while someone else checked the back of your neck for movement. And it wasn't just lice. Fleas were common. So were bedbugs. And if you worked with animals, you likely had mites. Hygiene, in this sense, wasn't about being clean. It was about managing the invasion. People boiled their clothes when they had water and firewood. They smoked them over sulfur. They dusted themselves with ashes or herbs or chalk. They even burned old bedding when the infestation got bad enough. But the parasites always came back. They lived in the walls, in the straw, in the seams of garments that had never been fully washed. To make things worse, there were beliefs about cleanliness that made true hygiene harder to practice. It was thought, in some places and periods, that bathing too often weakened the body, that it allowed bad air to enter the pores, and that diseases were carried by mists or smells. So people avoided water, especially hot water. They wore layers to keep their sweat in, and they perfumed their skin instead of washing it. A pouch of lavender or rosemary pinned to the collar. A small bottle of rose water to dab on the wrists, not because it worked, but because it masked the worst of the stench. And still, people cared. They tried. Women plucked facial hair, cleaned under their nails, and rinsed their faces in cold water when they could. Men trimmed their beards with knives or fire. Children were scrubbed down before church or festivals if water and soap were available. Cleanliness wasn't absent. It was just limited, controlled by seasons, by wealth, by access. In winter, washing was nearly impossible. In drought, water was saved for drinking. In famine, no one cared what you smelled like. The concept of personal space didn't exist the way it does now. People slept close together, worked side by side, and traveled in tight carts or boats or wagons. So the smells and the lice and the general state of bodily affairs weren't just your problem. They were everyone's. And after a while, you stopped noticing. Or you convinced yourself that you did. Because what was the point of worrying about something no one could avoid? Even monasteries, with their structured routines and better access to clean water, struggled with infestations. Robes were passed down, mattresses were straw-filled and reused, and not every monk took his vows as a vow of washing. Some wrote about lice in their letters. Some drew them in the margins of prayer books, and some simply accepted them as part of the burden of earthly life. Lice, after all, were not deadly, not directly, but they were constant, and that constant itch, that never-ending crawl beneath the collar or behind the knee, was a quiet reminder that no matter how much you tried to keep yourself clean, the world you lived in had other plans. And while people scratched and combed and hoped, they also prayed for relief, for strength, or just for a night of sleep without movement beneath the skin. But sleep was never still, and neither was the dirt. It is easy to imagine that hygiene is only about the body, about skin and hair and the presence or absence of water. But in the Middle Ages, what you wore was as important as how you wore it. Clothes were not decorations. They were armor against cold, against exposure, against judgment, and most importantly, against the dirt that surrounded you, settled into your pores, and stayed there longer than it should have. But these clothes were not washed often, and they were almost never truly clean. Most people had just one set of garments, maybe two if they were fortunate. A tunic, some underclothes if you could afford them, and a cloak when the air turned sharp. These clothes were worn day after day, night after night. They absorbed everything: smoke from the fire, sweat from long hours in the field, the faint smell of onions or fish or spoiled meat from whatever you last ate. And the clothes didn't forget. They held on to those smells, those traces, like history etched into fabric. Linen, when it was available, was used for undergarments. It was softer, easier to wash, and it breathed better. But linen didn't last forever. It tore, it stained, and it yellowed with time. Wool was more common, heavy, warm, and nearly impossible to clean without ruining it. So people brushed it, beat it, shook it out, or hung it near a fire to chase away dampness. True washing with water and soap and patience was rare, not because people didn't want to be clean, but because the process was long, difficult, and often dangerous for the fabric itself. Washing meant hauling water, heating it, scrubbing garments on stones or with ash and soap made from animal fat and lye, and then hoping for a dry day to hang them out without inviting rain, mold, or wind strong enough to carry your only tunic into the trees. In towns, some women worked as laundresses, strong-armed and always busy, wringing, pounding, and boiling garments for a fee. Their backs bent early, their hands red and cracked from endless wet winters, but they kept clothes moving. They were part of the quiet hygiene effort that went unnoticed until it disappeared. In monasteries and noble households, washing was more frequent. Servants did the work, and wealth bought fresh fabric. But even then, garments were reused, shared, patched again and again, until the original cloth was a memory. Perfumed sachets were sewn into hems or tucked into sleeves to mask the smell. Cloaks were brushed with stiff straw or wire to remove hair, dust, or worse. And under it all, there was always the fear of lice. Clothing seams were a favorite hiding place. The warmth of the skin, the darkness of the layers, the safety of folds made them the perfect shelter. People turned their clothes inside out to shake them. They ran hot irons along seams. They picked and scratched. And they endured, because what else could they do? You could not burn what you could not replace. You could not wash what would not dry. You could only wear it, live in it, and hope it held together a little longer. And then there were shoes, or the absence of them. Many walked barefoot, especially in the countryside. Roads were mud, dust, or stones, and every step left a mark, both on the ground and on the skin. Feet cracked, bled, hardened. In winter, they froze. In summer, they burned. And shoes, when they existed, were often made of leather, stiff and reused, never quite dry, never quite whole. They protected little. They trapped more than they saved. People tried their best. They lined shoes with straw. They stuffed cloaks with rags. They sewed patches over patches until the garment was more thread than cloth. And when things could no longer be worn, they were not thrown away. They were unraveled, turned into rags, or repurposed into something new. Nothing was wasted, not because of virtue, but because of need. So, if you picture a medieval man or woman walking through the streets, imagine not just the clothes on their back, but the weight of them, the history, the grime, the repairs made by candlelight, the smell that no longer surprised them, and the quiet dignity of wearing something again and again, because there was no other choice. If you stepped outside your home in a medieval town, the first thing to meet you was not always the cold or the clamor or the sight of neighbors, but the smell. It clung to everything. It rolled down alleys and drifted across market squares. It rose from gutters and flowed beneath carts and hooves and wheels. It was the result of 1,000 small things that no one had the time or the means to clean. Waste, filth, rot. All of it left where it landed, and the streets, uneven and narrow, carried it like water down a hill. Most towns had no paving. Some had cobblestones, placed with care long ago, but time and footsteps and weather had shifted them until they no longer fit together. Gaps filled with muck, holes collected rain and refuse. People dumped their chamber pots directly into the street, sometimes with a warning call, sometimes not. The phrase, "Look out below," was not a joke. It was a matter of survival. Above, windows swung open. Below, the unlucky passerby ducked or didn't. Animals shared the space. Dogs, pigs, chickens, goats. Some belonged to households. Some wandered freely. They left behind more than footprints. In the absence of organized collection or regulation, animals cleaned what they could, but added their own layers of waste in return. A pig might eat the scraps tossed from a tavern door. A dog might dig through yesterday's discarded stew bones. But what they left behind was never picked up. It dried, it soaked, it sank into the soil. Rain helped and hurt. It washed the filth away, if briefly. But it also turned the streets into soup, a mix of mud and manure, ashes and rotten food, blood from the butcher's block, and grease from the tanner's shop. Wooden walkways were sometimes built above the worst parts, but they broke or vanished. And then there was the market, with its smells and spills, its fish guts and chicken feathers, its hunks of meat dropped and picked up and sold again. Shoes did little to protect against this. Feet soaked through, toes froze or blistered, heels cracked. People wiped their soles with straw or on the edges of stones. Some wrapped rags around their legs. Others simply walked and tried not to think about what seeped in, because there was no escaping the street. It was where you worked, walked, met, traded, begged, fought. It was everything between everything else. And when illness came, no one thought to sweep. The filth was ordinary. It was invisible by familiarity. Plague crept silently across the same stones where children played and women carried bread and men drove carts. But no one traced the sickness to the slime beneath their boots. They looked instead to the sky or the wind or the sins of others. Cities tried. Some passed laws. Street sweepers were hired in places like London and Paris, though rarely paid enough or kept long. Rules were written. Do not dump waste in public. Do not slaughter animals outside your shop. Do not let your cesspit overflow into the neighbor's well. But rules without teeth are dreams, and few wanted to be the one to report a neighbor, especially when your own doorstep was not so different. And so the filth remained. It piled up in corners and ran in channels. It dried to dust and rose in summer breezes. It soaked into clothes, into breath, into memory. Visitors from cleaner lands wrote about it. Priests preached about it. Doctors ignored it. And children grew up playing in it without ever questioning why their hands turned black or why their feet never felt clean. Because the streets were not separate from daily life. They were daily life. They connected the baker to the butcher, the church to the tavern, the house to the graveyard, and no one could live without them, even if the price of walking was the weight of what you carried back home. To speak of hygiene in the Middle Ages without speaking of water is to miss the center of the struggle, because water was not only a tool, it was also a mystery. It cleaned, but it also carried illness. It gave life, but it could just as easily take it. And for most people, water was not something that arrived on command. It had to be found, fetched, carried, and kept. And even then, it was never certain whether it helped more than it harmed. Wells were common in villages, simple, deep holes with a rope and bucket. Some had wooden frames or stone walls. Others were just pits in the ground. And not all were clean. A well dug too close to a cesspit or graveyard or pigsty could draw in more than water. But people drank anyway, because thirst was stronger than fear, and because most had no other choice. Rain barrels helped when the weather cooperated. Streams offered a steady flow if you did not mind what happened upstream. But no one could test for purity. They looked instead. If the water was clear, if it smelled fresh, it was probably fine. But that assumption came with a price. In towns, water flowed through wooden pipes or stone channels, sometimes open, sometimes covered. It passed through workshops and kitchens, through streets and markets, picking up whatever lay in its path: blood, ashes, dyes, oils. And the same water that ran through the tanner's yard might fill the basin at the baker's door. It was a cycle no one could break, only participate in. Still, people valued water. They knew its power. Bathhouses, when they existed, were built near rivers or springs. They were places of gathering, of warmth, of temporary cleanliness. Men and women bathed separately, at least in theory. Steam rose from heated tubs. Herbs were added for smell or supposed healing. And for a short while people felt better. Their skin loosened, their joints eased. They left lighter, even if the effect faded by morning. But bathhouses came with suspicion. Not everyone trusted them. Some claimed the heat weakened the spirit. Others feared the spread of disease. When plague struck, many avoided the bathhouse altogether, blaming its steam for drawing sickness from the air. And over time, some towns closed them. Others let them fall apart. And soon, public bathing became less common, not because people lost interest, but because fear won. In wealthier homes, baths were taken with effort. A wooden tub hauled in, filled by hand with heated water, often poured by servants in shifts. The lord or lady sat for a short time, scented oils nearby, linens ready to dry. But water cooled quickly, and even in castles it was rarely done more than a few times a year. The work was too great, the benefits too fleeting. For most, water was used sparingly. A splash to the face in the morning, a rinse of hands before a meal, if custom demanded, feet washed after long travel, babies cleaned after birth, the dead wiped before burial. But soap was scarce, and warm water even more so. Many washed in streams, crouched low to avoid wind and eyes. Others brought home pails and did what they could in corners of rooms that never truly dried. And always there was caution, the belief that water opened the pores and that open pores allowed sickness to enter. It was better, some thought, to keep the dirt on and the world out. Sweat sealed the skin, ash covered the smell, and water, though needed, was treated with hesitation. So people lived between moments of rinsing and long stretches of filth, and they adjusted. They stopped noticing, or they decided it was simply part of the body, like fingernails or wrinkles or breath. And when they dreamed of rivers, it was not for swimming, but for carrying buckets back home without spilling them on the road. There is a strange kind of memory that lives in the hands, not the memory of thoughts or dreams or names, but the memory of what they have touched, held, pressed, scraped, spilled, gathered, cleaned, carried, thrown, and sometimes buried. And in the medieval world, where gloves were rare and work was constant, hands remembered everything. They bore the marks of fire and frost, of flour and blood, of rope and iron. And yet, in a time when cleanliness was more aspiration than expectation, hands were also one of the most visible signs of who you were, how you lived, and what you had touched to survive another day. People used their hands for everything. There were no forks at most tables, no rubber handles on buckets, no soap dispensers or polished rails. Bread was broken with fingers. Meat was torn, dipped, chewed, and passed. Tools were gripped hard with no padding. Doors were pushed open with open palms stained with dust, sweat, or ash. The hand was the tool of the body, more important than the eye, more faithful than the mouth, and more punished by the world it worked in. But the world did not care for soft palms, and washing, though mentioned in church sermons and written into some household guides was often symbolic rather than thorough. A quick dip into cool water before prayer, a basin passed at table, a rinse that washed away the surface without touching what clung to the skin beneath the nails or along the lines of the knuckles. Soap, when it was used at all, was rough, gray, and smelled of lard or ash. It scraped more than it softened. It left skin dry, but rarely clean. Hands touched bread dough, and then coal, then straw, then animals, then children, then coins, then wounds, and the line between what was safe and what was not was blurred, not by ignorance, but by necessity. There were no sanitizers, no gloves, no sterile cloths. Cloth itself was too valuable. It was used until it tore, then stitched, then used again. Hands wiped on aprons, on trousers, on wood, or on themselves. And still they went back to work. In markets, coins passed from seller to buyer without pause. Meat was weighed by hand. Fish were scaled and tossed without rinsing. Cheese was pressed with fingers. And in all this motion, there was no effort to pause or wash. Time did not allow it. Water was not always near. And the belief that invisible things could harm you was not yet fully formed. Smells were feared. Sins were feared. But germs were not yet named. And so the hand, stained as it was, remained the trusted servant of daily life. Even the sick were touched without thought. A mother wiped the brow of a fevered child, then stirred soup, then swept ashes. A priest placed fingers on the lips of a dying man, then turned to bless another. A barber surgeon held a knife with hands that had just closed a wound. And while some rinsed between tasks, others did not. Because work was endless. Because rest was rare. Because hands could not stop just to be made clean. But still, some tried. There are records of washing stations near churches, of basins outside kitchens, of buckets hung beside back doors. In monasteries, monks rinsed before meals, their motions silent and slow, a ritual more than a remedy. In noble homes, servants poured water from jugs over the hands of guests. Towels were offered, sometimes perfumed, sometimes plain. And for a moment there was a gesture toward purity. But it passed quickly, like everything else, because the hand could not stay idle, and because the hand could not stay clean. It reached again, for wood, for wool, for wounds, for water, and in doing so it remembered, not with words, but with feel, with calluses that thickened, with cracks that stung in winter, with dirt that gathered in the folds of the skin and never quite left. And so the hand, marked by years and labor, bore the quiet story of medieval hygiene in the lines it carried and the things it could never forget. When someone smiled in the Middle Ages, what you saw was not just the curve of lips or the crinkle around the eyes, but a map of survival carved into the mouth, a record of years without sugar and years with too much, of bread that was too hard and fruit that was too rare, of pain that never received a name and infections that were endured in silence. Because for most people, teeth were not parts of the body to be cared for. They were tools to be used until they cracked, bled, or fell out. And only then did anyone stop to notice how badly they hurt. There were no toothbrushes as we know them now, no minty paste, no soft bristles or bright white foam, just whatever could be chewed, rubbed, or rinsed in hopes of scraping away the day's grime. And even that depended on where you lived, how much you owned, and whether anyone ever taught you to care about what was inside your own mouth. Some used cloth, others used sticks, Some rinsed with wine or vinegar or water when it was clean enough, and a few chewed on herbs or mint or sage, not to preserve health, but to mask smell, because decay made itself known faster than anything else, and a foul mouth was hard to ignore in a world where people stood close and rooms were small. Toothaches were among the most dreaded of pains, not because they were sudden, but because they were constant, dull at first, then sharp, then blinding, and no one had the tools to fix them. You went to a barber, not a doctor. The barber had pliers and a chair and a strong arm. If you were lucky, the tooth came out in one pull. If not, it broke, and then the fragments stayed in your gums, swelling, festering, slowly poisoning you from the inside. And still you went back to work, because there was no other choice. Some people lost all their teeth early. By 30, they chewed soft bread with their gums and swallowed their meat whole. Others kept a few, crooked, blackened, loose, and hid their smiles behind hands or silence. The rich sometimes used powders made from crushed shells or bones to polish what remained. But the powders were harsh and wore away the enamel, and even those who could afford honey and spices suffered, because sugar, once rare, was becoming more common, and with it came rot. Children learned early. They bit into crusts, into apples, into bones, and their teeth cracked without warning. A chipped tooth was ignored. A lost tooth was accepted. Gums bled. Breath turned sour. And the mouth, meant for laughter, for speech, for song, became instead a place of quiet endurance. No one complained, or if they did, it was short, because everyone understood. A bad tooth was like a bad winter. It came, it stayed, and it left you weaker than before. And yet the mouth was central to life. It tasted, it spoke, it kissed, it prayed. It was the first thing that met the cup and the last thing to feel the pain of hunger. And so people did what they could. They sucked on cloves. They pressed garlic against their gums. They made poultices of herbs and salt and spit. They tied strings to teeth and pulled them at dawn. They waited for swelling to pass. They swallowed pain and kept going. There were no dentists, no clean offices, no sterile chairs or soft music. There were hands, knives, cloth, and courage. And when someone finally lost the last tooth, they did not mourn it. They adjusted. They drank more broth. They ate more porridge. They stopped biting and started pressing food between tongue and palate. And they continued living because even in pain, the world did not wait. Hair, unlike clothes, could not be washed and hung in the wind to dry every day, nor could it be stored away from smoke or soot or sweat. It stayed with you, on your head, your face, your body, through every shift of season and hour, through illness and labor, through sleep and prayer and silence. And because of that, hair in the Middle Ages was not just a part of appearance. It was a vessel, a net that caught the world as it passed, a quiet witness to everything you touched, smelled, breathed, and endured. For men, hair varied, long for some, short for others, shaved in patches for monks and priests, or simply let to grow until the weight made it fall against the neck or curl behind the ears. Beards were common, though not always by choice, and trimming them was done with knives not meant for comfort. Oil was rare, and combs even rarer. A comb made from bone or wood might be shared among a family, passed from hand to hand like a relic, with teeth broken and stained, but still useful, still needed. because lice never slept, and no one was safe from their arrival. For women, hair was often considered a symbol of virtue, of obedience, of station, and so it was kept long, tied, braided, hidden under veils, wrapped in cloth, pinned in loops. Washing it was a chore, not only because water was cold and time was short, but because drying it took hours, and most homes were damp, smoky, crowded. A head washed in the morning stayed wet until evening, and in winter that meant chills and coughing. So many chose to avoid washing at all. They brushed instead, when they could, with stiff bristles or fingers, and they powdered the scalp with flour or herbs to dull the smell. Lice were everywhere. No one was surprised to find them, and no one thought it shameful. Children scratched at their necks, women checked each other's scalps, men burned old straw bedding when the itching grew too much. There were remedies, vinegar, ashes, boiled roots, but none were perfect. Some shaved their heads and wore caps, others combed daily and hoped it would be enough. But the lice always returned. They traveled in hats, in cloaks, in hair left loose too long, and they did not care if you were a farmer or a priest, a servant or a noble. They found warmth, and they stayed. Facial hair was a separate challenge. Razors were crude, often reused, never sterile. A man might scrape his chin once a week, or not at all. Blood was common, infection too. Barbers worked quickly, sharpening their blades on leather straps, wiping them clean with cloth that had already touched 10 others. Some shaved at home, by candlelight, with cold water and trembling hands. Others let their beards grow and said it was for God, or for warmth, or because time did not allow for anything else. And then there were the invisible things hair held: smoke from the hearth, grease from the skillet, dust from the road, the scent of the fields, of animals, of illness. A woman's hair might smell like lavender for an hour after festival, but by nightfall it smelled like firewood and meat. A man's beard might catch the crumbs of bread or the steam of broth, and though some tried to perfume themselves, the scent faded fast, buried beneath the daily layers of life. So hair was not just appearance, it was function. It protected the scalp from sun, it warmed the neck in wind, it kept insects off the skin, though it also gave them shelter. It carried what soap could not remove and what prayer could not purify. And people accepted that. They learned to live with it, to braid it and forget it, to wrap it and ignore the itch, to comb it and hope just a little that it might stay quiet for another day. There is a comfort in clean clothes that most people now take for granted. The soft weight of cloth that smells of nothing, or perhaps of wind or soap, that fits without itch, that touches the skin without offense. But for the people of the Middle Ages, clothing was less about comfort and more about necessity, a layer between flesh and weather, between dignity and exposure. And because it was so hard to make, to buy, to repair, to dry, it was used and reused far beyond what we would consider acceptable today, until it frayed at the edges, tore at the seams, darkened with grease and smoke and life, and only then was it finally replaced or repurposed into rags, padding, or patches. Most people owned only one set of clothing, sometimes two, and this meant that what they wore was what they lived in, what they slept in, what they worked in, what they walked in through fields, streets, markets, forests, and barns. And because of this, clothes were not changed often, and certainly not daily, nor even weekly for some. especially those who had no household servants or access to warm water or firewood to heat a tub, because washing clothes was not only time-consuming but dangerous in winter, when wet cloth could freeze before it dried and cause illness more swiftly than dirt ever did. Linen was prized for being easier to clean than wool, and so underclothes were made of it when possible. Thin garments worn next to the skin to catch the sweat, the skin flakes, the oils of the body, so that the outer layer might stay clean longer. And even then, these linens were boiled, not for cleanliness as we understand it, but because boiling softened the cloth and helped remove the stiffness caused by repeated wear, though stains remained and odors often did as well, especially in warmer months when bodies sweated more and air moved less freely inside stone walls and shuttered windows. Outer garments, cloaks, tunics, dresses, hose were heavier, more expensive, and washed less often, sometimes brushed with stiff tools, sometimes beaten on rocks near rivers and in towns, taken to washerwomen who knew how to handle tough fabrics with quick hands, strong arms, and the knowledge of which stains could be scrubbed with ash and which ones could only be faded by sunlight over time. But not everyone could afford such help, and many made do with what they had, hanging clothes near the hearth, airing them out on fences, brushing them off with hands made rough by years of handling things no one wanted to touch. Clothing smelled like the life it had witnessed, the sweat of the wearer, the smoke of the fire, the grease of the kitchen, the damp of the cellar, the mud of the road. Perfume was rare, and when used, it was applied to the skin or to a handkerchief, not to the fabric itself, because it faded quickly and could not mask what had already sunk deep into the fibers. A noble might scent their gloves or collar, but even in courts, the smell of human closeness, of hair and cloth and effort, was present in every hall. When garments were washed, they were dried in the sun, draped over hedges, hung from lines if there was space, laid over stones or walls, and always guarded carefully, for clothing was valuable, sometimes the most valuable thing a person owned, and theft of a tunic or a pair of boots could mean the loss of dignity, of work, of shelter, and so clothes were patched again and again, sleeves lengthened with old scraps, collars reinforced, holes hidden beneath embroidery or thick stitching, and every thread told a story of use, of seasons survived, of growing children and shrinking options. So people dressed not to be seen but to be covered, not for style but for survival. And though paintings show the rich in silk and color, most wore browns and grays and off-whites, the color of earth, of dust, of wear, and they lived in these garments until they became like second skin, until taking them off felt strange, and putting them on again was like returning to the person they were yesterday, and the day before, and the month before that. To understand hygiene in the Middle Ages, one must look down, not up, because the story of dirt begins at the ground, where people walked, worked, stood, and slept, and the feet, more than any other part of the body, knew what the world really felt like, not in theory, not in poetry, but in mud and stones and straw soaked with things no one wanted to name, and though boots and shoes existed, they were not owned by everyone, and even when they were worn until the soles peeled away and the leather cracked with cold and damp, and still the feet moved forward, because there was no other choice. Streets were not clean. Cobblestones, where they existed, were uneven and covered in waste, not just from animals, but from humans as well, because many towns and villages had no system for managing what came out of the body, and so chamber pots were emptied into the streets or into ditches or streams, and the rest settled where it fell, trampled into the soil, carried by wheels and hooves and bare heels, dried by sun, stirred by wind, and never truly removed, only layered one day over the next, one life over another. In villages, people walked through earth made dark by years of use, and in towns they stepped over refuse and past puddles that never quite dried, puddles that held everything from fish bones to blood to bits of cloth, and in some places walkways were raised with wooden planks or boards, but those who walked on them still carried the dust of the day on their clothes, on their feet, on the hems of their garments, and when they entered their homes, that dust came with them, settled into the floor, into the straw bedding, into the corners where it was swept once a week, perhaps with brooms made of twigs or rushes. Bathing the feet was a luxury for many. In monasteries, it was done as a sign of humility, a ritual of washing another's feet to honor Christ. But outside those walls, the feet were washed when they hurt, or when they bled, or when the smell could no longer be ignored, and even then, only if water was near and firewood was available, because heating water took effort and time was short and warmth was precious. So people rinsed their feet in cold streams or wiped them with rags, but rarely did they soak them, scrub them, tend to them with oils or care, unless they were injured, and even then treatment was simple. Wrap the wound, bind the toe, walk slower if you must. Blisters and cuts were common. Infections, too. A splinter might fester for days. A stone bruise might swell. But life continued. There were fields to tend, fires to stoke, animals to herd, and so the feet carried on, swollen or cracked or bleeding, because they were the foundation of survival. And though they were rarely praised or cared for, they were always used, always demanded, always expected to carry the weight of the body and the burdens of the world. Shoes, when worn, were made of leather or wood, sometimes both, shaped without much regard for the unique shape of the foot, and often stuffed with straw or cloth for warmth. Socks were rare, insoles unknown, and when shoes failed, people walked barefoot, through frost, through thorns, through streets lined with filth, and still they walked, because the body adapted, the skin grew thicker, the pain became familiar, and hygiene, in the sense of cleansing or protection, was a dream that belonged to another world, one with time, one with means, one with less mud. And so the feet, cracked and calloused, carried not only the body, but the memory of where it had been, the story of what it had stepped through, the quiet truth of a world where nothing stayed clean for long, and everything eventually returned to the ground. If the feet bore the burden of movement, the hands bore the burden of contact, because nothing in the Middle Ages could be done without the hands, and nothing they touched was ever truly clean, not the wood of the tools, not the cloth of the garments, not the grain in the sack, not the bread on the table, not even the water from the well, because every object carried something with it, a residue of use, of sweat, of life, and the hands, always reaching, always working, were the bridge between the body and the world, and that bridge was never washed as often as it should have been. Soap existed, but it was rough and scarce, made from animal fat and ashes, harsh on the skin, unpleasant to smell, and so not everyone used it unless absolutely necessary. and most people reserved it for laundry or rare full-body baths, not for daily scrubbing of the fingers, and so the dirt remained, settled in the folds, under the nails, around the knuckles, a quiet gray that deepened over time, and when someone wiped their mouth or rubbed their eyes or fed a child, they did so with hands that had touched the barn door, the sheep's wool, the market coins, and the inside of the chimney without pause. Children learned to use their hands early, to gather, to knead, to stitch, to lift, to sweep, and also to share, to fight, to dig. They dug holes with bare fingers, they caught insects, they pulled weeds, they handled raw meat and wild herbs and did not stop to rinse, because water was not always close, and even if it was not always clean, and even if it was clean, it was not always warm, and so washing was a luxury, a break in the rhythm of labor, not a habit. Meals were eaten with the hands, knives were shared, and spoons were often absent. Bread was torn, meat was gripped, stew was scooped with crusts or fingers or both, and afterward hands were wiped on aprons, on sleeves, on whatever was nearby. Some people rinsed in basins, if one had been prepared. Others rubbed their hands with straw. A few wiped with damp cloths. But even among the wealthy, the idea of washing before meals was more about ritual than sanitation. And among the poor, it was often skipped entirely in favor of saving time and water for something more pressing. Infection spread through hands, from person to person, from object to object. A small cut could fester if touched too often with dirty fingers. A newborn could fall ill from a midwife's unwashed palms. But people did not know the words for bacteria or germs. They spoke instead of bad air, of humors, of curses, and though some healers warned against touching open wounds, others prescribed poultices applied by hand, and no one thought twice about handling the sick or the dying without first cleansing the skin. The nails held stories of their own, not clipped often, not filed, just broken off in work, or bitten down, or left to grow until they cracked. Beneath them lived soil, ash, crumbs, and sometimes more. A groom might carry traces of the stable beneath his thumbnail. A cook might carry traces of garlic or blood. And yet life continued. Meals were prepared, children were rocked, prayers were whispered with clasped fingers that had never known soap that week, or even that month. And the skin aged with it. Hands became rough, cracked, blistered, sun-darkened. Calluses formed, scars remained. A washerwoman's hands looked nothing like a baker's, and a blacksmith's nothing like a scribe's. But they were all marked by labor, by touch, by years of working with tools and animals and people, and never quite scrubbing away what they gathered along the way. Hygiene was not only about what people did to their bodies, but also what surrounded them when they did nothing, when they sat, when they slept, when they breathed. And in the Middle Ages, the home was not a clean place in the modern sense, not sterile, not sanitized, but instead a living space full of texture and smell and sound, where walls held in not only warmth, but also moisture and smoke and everything that came from life itself, because there were no air purifiers, no exhaust fans, no sterile tiles, only stone, wood, clay, and straw, each absorbing what it touched, each changing slowly over time, growing darker with soot, softer with mold, richer with the invisible traces of people who never stopped breathing inside. In a peasant home, the floor was often made of packed earth, sometimes covered with straw, sometimes mixed with ash or herbs, to mask the smell, though the smell remained, because people brought in the day on their boots, on their clothes, on their skin, and it stayed, settled into the corners, clung to the beams, waited between the fibers of the bedding, and even when the straw was replaced, which was not often, it had already absorbed enough to leave a memory behind, a scent of damp, of skin, of heat and animal and food and waste, because life did not separate itself neatly in that world. It all happened together, layered one atop the next. Smoke was constant. Hearths burned through winter and sometimes even summer, and the smoke, having nowhere to go but upward and outward, filled the space first, crept into the thatch of the roof, stained the walls black, made the air heavy, made the lungs ache, and though some homes had chimneys, many did not, and the smoke escaped slowly, if at all, drifting out through holes in the roof or between wooden planks, leaving behind not only darkness on the surfaces, but darkness in the chest, in the breath, especially for children, for the elderly, for those already weak. Windows were rare, and where they existed, they were small, covered with cloth or parchment or shutters, because glass was a luxury, and warmth was more valuable than light, and so the air did not circulate well, did not renew itself, did not carry out the smells of cooking, of sweat, of illness, and so these smells layered too, one upon another, growing thicker with time, until every room had its own identity, its own breath, shaped by who had lived there and for how long and what they had endured. Bedding was shared, beds were shared, rooms were shared. Families slept together, not only from affection, but from necessity, from the need for warmth, from the lack of space, and this closeness brought comfort, but also contagion, because when one person coughed, the others heard it in the night, and when one developed a rash or a fever, there was no place to go, no place to hide, and illness passed from one to the next with nothing more than breath, than touch, than time spent under the same roof. Insects lived in the walls, in the straw, in the cracks between stones, fleas, lice, mites. They bit in the night, they nested in clothes, they crept into the folds of blankets and the hems of tunics, and no one thought to eliminate them, only to manage them, to sweep more often, to air the bedding when the sun was warm, to boil what could be boiled, though that was not much, and even then the insects returned, because the conditions that welcomed them never truly left. They were part of the house, part of the system, part of what it meant to live under a roof with others and never quite have enough space, enough soap, enough firewood to cleanse it all away. And still, people lived there, were born there, died there, told stories by the fire, sang songs, said prayers, and between the prayers and the songs, they coughed, they scratched, they wiped their eyes with the backs of their hands, and they waited for the next season, the next frost, the next fever, hoping perhaps it would pass by their home this time. In the world of the Middle Ages, where water did not run through pipes and privacy was often a luxury few could afford, the problem of human waste was not hidden behind doors or flushed away into distant places, but remained close, visible, and constant, a reminder that the body was not polite, not clean, not easy to manage, and so men and women lived beside what their bodies produced, finding ways to cope, to conceal, to adapt, but never truly to remove, because the systems that would allow for true sanitation had not yet been born, and people made do with what they had, with habits inherited, with knowledge passed down, with wood and straw and pots and soil. In the countryside, where homes were often isolated and land was more plentiful, people used pits dug near their dwellings, sometimes with wooden seats, sometimes just holes, and the waste was covered with earth or ash when possible, though not always, especially in winter, when the ground was frozen and shovels struck only frost, and so the smells grew stronger and the flies more persistent, and families lived with it, because there was nowhere else to go, and every creature has needs that cannot be postponed by cold or snow or convenience. In towns, space was tighter, and so chamber pots were used, simple clay or wooden vessels placed under beds or behind curtains, used by all members of the household and emptied once or twice a day, sometimes into designated pits, sometimes into ditches that ran along the sides of streets, and sometimes simply thrown from windows with a shouted warning that did not always reach in time, and those walking below learned to keep to the center of the lane, to glance upward, to move quickly, because what fell from above was not always rain. The streets carried the burden next. In dry weather, dust rose with every footstep, but that dust was not pure. It was made of dried manure, dried urine, dried food scraps, ash, and the soft crumbling of whatever had settled there the day before. In wet weather the dust turned to sludge, a thick dark mixture that clung to shoes and hems and wheels and hooves, and which no one could avoid entirely, no matter how clean they had been when they left their home, and so filth traveled with them, back into kitchens, onto beds, into the cracks of the floor where children played or animals rested. There were some regulations. In larger cities, laws were written to prohibit dumping waste into streets or rivers, and fines were established, but enforcement was rare, and even where it existed, people had no other options, no public latrines, no underground sewers, no closed system to carry it all away, and so the rules became more like hopes, written by those who wanted change, ignored by those who could not afford it. And every year the same arguments returned, the same complaints, the same suggestions, none of which truly changed how people lived day to day. Some monasteries developed better systems. They built latrines over running water, channeled waste away, and made rules about cleansing and silence and dignity. But these were rare, and even then the monks who cleaned the channels, who stirred the pits, who emptied the barrels, bore the task in silence, sometimes with gloves of cloth, sometimes without, and they washed when they could, but the smell remained, followed them through cloisters, clung to their robes, because no act of service removes all traces, and the body continues to speak even when ignored. And so waste was part of life, accepted, managed, never conquered. Its presence shaped where people walked, where they built, where they ate, where they rested. It shaped the air, the mood, the health, and though no one liked it, no one truly escaped it, because in the end, every body is the same, and the earth was not yet ready to carry it away unseen. The idea of a doctor in the Middle Ages brings to mind not a clean figure in white, but a man in layered robes, often dark, carrying a leather bag, a stick, or sometimes wearing a beaked mask filled with herbs when plague stalked the streets, because healing was not a science, but a mixture of observation, tradition, prayer, and trial, and doctors, whether trained or self-declared, worked with what they had, which often meant tools made of metal or bone, kept not in sterile boxes, but wrapped in cloth, stored beside powders and dried roots, and used again and again without boiling, without wiping, without understanding what truly hid on the blades. A doctor might be called to a home where fever had taken hold, or where a wound refused to close, or where a woman could no longer rise after childbirth, and he would enter not with certainty, but with a list of possible causes spoken in Latin, a book of symptoms, and a pouch of remedies passed down through years of use, and most of those remedies began with cleansing, not of the body, but of the spirit, through bleeding or purging, or with herbal mixtures meant to balance the humors, the invisible fluids believed to govern all health. When wounds were treated, they were washed with wine if wine was available, or with water if not. But the water might have come from a bucket used for livestock, or from a barrel that had not been cleaned in weeks. And though the intention was to clean, the reality was often the opposite, because no one could see what lingered in the liquid, and so washing became a ritual, not a guarantee, a gesture of care in a world without microscopes or antiseptics, or the knowledge of how infection truly spread. Tools were used quickly: knives, hooks, needles, heated metal when needed. Bones were set by hand. Flesh was stitched with coarse thread. Abscesses were drained. Leeches were applied. And each time the doctor wiped his hands on a cloth or apron or sleeve, and moved on to the next home, the next case, carrying with him not only his tools and learning, but also whatever lingered from the last place he had been, and the cycle of sickness continued, not from neglect, but from the limits of what people knew and what they had. Clean bandages were rare. Cloth was reused, washed in rivers, hung to dry in sun or smoke, dried quickly or not at all, and when reapplied, they often carried more than comfort, because in this world soft linen could become a threat, and a healer's touch, though meant to soothe, might introduce something unseen, something that would grow under the surface until the flesh darkened. The fever climbed, and the prayers began again. And yet people trusted them. They trusted the barber who pulled teeth and drained blood, the nun who made poultices from herbs grown in the convent garden, the wise woman who knew when to bind and when to burn, because options were few, and illness was a mystery, and every effort to heal was worth trying, even if it hurt, even if it failed, because the alternative was silence, was doing nothing, was watching someone fade without lifting a hand. Cleanliness, as a concept, was not absent from healing, but it was not defined the way we know it now. It meant keeping flies away. It meant wiping away pus or blood. It meant fresh straw on the bed, a cool cloth on the brow, a room where the air could move, where the smells were not too strong. And these things, though simple, were the closest many came to hygiene in a medical sense. And when death came anyway, they did not blame the cloth or the water or the doctor, because the line between sickness and the sacred was thin, and sometimes, no matter how much was done, the illness still took what it wanted. When we think of hygiene, we often think of separation, the clean from the dirty, the inside from the outside, the human from the animal. But in the medieval world, those lines were thinner, more flexible, more blurred by necessity and habit, and so many people lived not only near animals, but with them, under the same roof, in the same space, sometimes even in the same room, because warmth was valuable and space was limited, and animals were not just creatures, but sources of food, of labor, of income, and to keep them close was practical, even if it meant accepting the smells, the noise, the presence of fur and hooves and droppings, where people cooked and slept and prayed. A small cottage might have one main room, and in that room would be a hearth, a table, a bed or two, and against the wall, or in a corner, a piglet or goat, a few chickens, perhaps even a calf, especially in winter when the cold could kill, and people brought what mattered most inside, including animals too valuable to risk in the frost, and though some tried to separate the space with a wooden barrier or a pile of straw, there was no real division, and the air was shared, the ground was shared. The silence was never full. The floor told the story. It was not smooth or polished or swept daily, but made of packed earth or rough stone with straw scattered to catch the damp, and that straw absorbed everything: spilled broth, spilled blood, urine, ash, manure, and was replaced not every day, but when it could no longer be walked on without slipping. And even then, the old straw was thrown just outside the door, where it joined the dung heap, the compost pile, the growing mountain of waste that waited for use as fertilizer, because nothing was truly thrown away in this world. Everything had a purpose, even filth. Children grew up stepping around animals, touching them, sleeping beside them. They watched the sow give birth in the corner of the room. They fed scraps to the goat from their own bowls. They learned the smells, the sounds, the signs of sickness in a hen or a dog, and they accepted that lice might come from fur as easily as from a sibling's hair, and that no soap would fix it. Only combing, only patience, only time. Cleanliness was not a matter of shiny surfaces, but of management. You swept when you could. You laid fresh straw when you had enough. You washed your hands if water was near, but more often you wiped them on cloth, on apron, on thigh, and then went back to kneading dough or milking the cow, because the cycle of life did not pause for washing, and no one expected it to. The smells of animals mixed with the smells of people, of food, of fire. At night the cottage was warm, not from insulation, but from breath and bodies, from 4 humans and 3 sheep and 1 rooster sharing a space no larger than a single modern room. And though the air was thick, and though illness spread quickly, the warmth was a blessing, and no one spoke of hygiene as a science, only of health as a hope, as something to pray for, to work toward with what was available. Monasteries and castles were different, more divided, more structured, but even there, animals had a place, in the stables, in the kitchens, in the courtyards, in the lower halls, and the people who tended them did not always wash before returning to the main rooms, because the connection between dirt and disease was not fully known, and habit was stronger than theory, and so the nobleman might dine in a hall where the servant had just shoveled dung, and no one thought to mention it. The fleas traveled with the dogs, the mice followed the grain. The flies lived in both barns and bedrooms, and no wall was thick enough to keep them out, not when windows were left open, when doors were just cloth, when roofs let in rain, and floors held puddles for days. And in that world, to be clean meant something else entirely. To understand how people thought about cleanliness in the Middle Ages, it helps to look not only at their skin or their homes, but also at what they wore, because clothing was not just protection or decoration, it was a second layer of the body, something lived in, slept in, worked in, often for days or weeks without change. And though people noticed when garments became heavy with sweat or stained with labor, They did not always have the means or the reason to wash them often, and so the fabric absorbed the life around it, and within it, and over time, it became a place not only of warmth, but also of discomfort, of infestation, of things that moved when no one was watching. Lice were not rare. They were common, expected, sometimes ignored, sometimes fought, but never entirely eliminated, and everyone had them, from peasants to kings, from nuns to knights, and though some tried to keep them away by changing linens or shaving heads or washing with vinegar, they always came back, because they lived not only on the body, but in the seams, in the folds, in the wool, and the linen, and the straw-stuffed mattress. And when a person dressed each morning, they were never fully alone. Fleas were another constant. They came from animals, from straw, from neighbors, and they bit without warning, leaving small red marks that itched and spread. And though most people tolerated them, scratching without comment, some carried knives made for catching them, thin blades designed to press against the skin and trap the pest, and some families placed bowls of water beside the bed, hoping to drown the ones that leapt from the sheets. And though these methods were clever, they rarely worked for long, because fleas knew no borders, and dirt was no obstacle. Clothes were rarely washed with soap, because soap was expensive, sometimes harsh, and water itself had to be carried, sometimes heated, sometimes fetched from a stream or a well, and to wash an entire outfit meant dedicating half a day or more, and many chose instead to air their garments, to beat them with sticks, to hang them in the smoke, to let the wind do what hands could not. And so cleanliness became a process of compromise, a balance between effort and need, between what was ideal and what was possible. Underclothes existed, but not always. Linen shirts and shifts were worn beneath heavier garments, and these were closer to the skin, more likely to absorb sweat, more likely to be washed. But even then, they were not changed daily, and a person might wear the same shirt for a week or longer, depending on the season, the labor, the availability of clean fabric, and so smells accumulated, not only of the body, but of the fire, of the food, of the road, until each person had a scent that was not quite unpleasant, but unmistakably human. Richer people had more clothes, and sometimes even servants to wash them, but that did not mean they were cleaner, only that they changed more often, that they owned more layers, more silks, more embroidered sleeves, and these too were rarely scrubbed, only brushed, only scented, only stored with herbs to keep moths away, and the illusion of cleanliness was maintained through effort and perfume, and the distance created by wealth, though underneath the same skin sweated, the same lice bit, and the same cloth gathered the years one stitch at a time. Children wore what was handed down, old clothes, patched clothes, clothes with stains that never left. They grew into garments that had already lived lives before them, and they learned early that washing was a luxury, that comfort was relative, that itchiness was something you lived with, and when they scratched in class or in chapel, no one scolded, because everyone scratched, and everyone knew. And so the body was not alone. It carried guests. It carried memories. It carried the warmth of clothes that never quite dried in the winter, and the heaviness of wool soaked with rain, and the itch of seams that rubbed the skin raw. And hygiene was not a fixed state, but a shifting line drawn between tolerance and need. And that line moved every day.